Deposition of Velhari Sand, strategist cast first tier, Compact Intelligence Directorate, Kethani Reach Interdiction Division. Submitted to the Tribunal of Recalibration, 3rd Session. Stardate Compact 447109. Record sealed pending classification review. Deponent attests that the following account is complete and unaltered. I will begin where the Tribunal has asked me to begin, though I will note at the outset, for the record, that I believe the Tribunal is asking the wrong question. You want to know why the interdiction of the human survey vessel failed. That framing assumes it failed for a recoverable reason, a miscalculation in the order of engagement protocol, an equipment fault aboard the severance of paths, a breakdown in the communication relay between my station and the forward watch buoys at Kethani 9 and Kethani 11. Those are the kinds of failures a tribunal can classify, annotate, and file in the appropriate drawer. Those are the kinds of failures that let everyone leave the chamber, believing the model is still sound, the doctrine still valid, the system only in need of a minor adjustment before the next operation proceeds as planned. The interdiction did not fail for any of those reasons. I will tell you what happened. I will tell you all of it, in sequence, the way a formal deposition requires, and I ask that the recorder note the following for the permanent record before we proceed. I have not revised this account in the 3 years since the event. I have not softened the conclusions. I have not adjusted the language to better fit the Directorate's subsequent institutional preferences. What I set down here is what I observed, what I calculated, and what I ultimately concluded. The Tribunal may find the conclusion uncomfortable. I found it considerably more than uncomfortable myself, and I have lived with it every operational day for 3 years. My name, for the record and for any parties reviewing this deposition who lack access to my service file, is Velhari Sand. I hold strategist cast first tier rank within the Compact Intelligence Directorate, Kethani Reach Division. I have served in that capacity for 19 years. Prior to my current assignment, I completed 11 years in field operations across 6 subsectors, working at Contact Grade 2 and Contact Grade 3 interdiction levels. I hold advanced certifications in behavioral modeling, species contact probability analysis, and operational doctrine design. I have authored or co-authored 14 modifications to the Compact's interdiction doctrine over the course of service, 9 of which were adopted in full. Before the interdiction at Kethani Reach, I had designed and overseen 41 containment and assessment operations against vessels from species the Compact classified as contact grade, 3 or below. In every prior operation, across 19 years and 41 engagements, the model performed within its predicted variance. Not close to variance in most cases, within it cleanly with outcomes that fell inside the first standard deviation bracket 84% of the time. I was, at the time I received the Kethani Reach assignment, considered among the 3 most reliable interdiction designers in the entire Directorate. My supervisor, Cast Primary Orvin Dale, described my record in the operational review preceding my assignment as consistent with the highest standards of predictive reliability the Directorate maintains. I say this not to establish pride. I have no particular attachment to my record. I say it to establish baseline, because when I tell you the model was wrong, I need you to understand what kind of person is telling you that. I am not a junior analyst who misread the input data. I am not a field operative who panicked under pressure. I am the person who built the inputs. I designed the model. I am telling you, under oath, that the structure we built was wrong, not at the edges, not in a detail, at its foundation. And I arrived at that conclusion not after the fact, not in retrospect, but standing in the analysis center of the severance of paths on the 11th day of the engagement, reading a translation that a very good linguist brought to me in person, because he did not trust the written report to convey the thing he needed me to understand. The Kethani Reach assignment came to me 14 months before the interdiction itself. The Directorate's intelligence survey had flagged humanity as a species of moderate elevated interest, which is In the classification language we use, a category indicating known presence confirmed, developmental tier below established threshold, anomalous capability indicators present. The specific anomalous indicators flagged were three. First, humanity demonstrated deep-range survey capability that exceeded what their apparent developmental tier should support. Their vessels were reaching farther than the Directorate's models predicted for a species at their technological stage. Second, their interstellar presence, while scattered, showed evidence of systematic expansion, not random, not reactive, but planned and methodical in ways that the survey fragment analysis suggested had been ongoing for a considerable time. Third, and most significant for my purposes, the communication intercept profile the Directorate had assembled indicated situational awareness considerably, in excess of what their vessel classes should permit. They knew where things were. They knew distances, stellar positions, traffic patterns in regions where they had no documented presence. They were watching, and they had been watching for longer than they should have been able to watch. The Directorate's initial classification placed humanity at contact grade 2, with a provisional flag for possible grade 3 reevaluation pending the outcome of the interdiction. A contact grade 2 classification in standard compact doctrine designates a species as follows: sapient, spacefaring, interstellar capability confirmed, technologically below the threshold of compact engagement risk, behaviorally within expected contact response parameters. It is, I will be direct about this, not a classification that carries much operational weight. A contact grade 2 interdiction is considered, in the Directorate's internal culture, a training exercise. Senior strategists don't run grade 2 interdictions. I was assigned to this one because of the anomalous capability indicators. Someone in the Directorate's senior tier was taking humanity slightly more seriously than the formal classification suggested, and they wanted someone reliable running the operation. I am certain now that the grade 2 classification was wrong. I believe it was wrong at the time it was assigned. But I did not question it when I received the assignment. I should have. That is something I will carry. A contact grade 2 interdiction is, in compact doctrine, a routine operation. The procedure is simple enough that it can be described in a paragraph. You position a vessel of superior class and capability at a choke point the target species uses, a transit corridor, a boundary approach, a navigational node they cannot avoid on their projected route. You activate the signal array and project a standard non-passage declaration in every frequency the target species uses, plus the full standard compact diplomatic spectrum. You wait. A contact grade 2 species, encountering a vessel of the severance of paths class and configuration at a declared boundary, does one of four things. They stop and hold position, either to assess or to await orders from their command structure. They stop and attempt communication, usually after a stabilization period of many hours. They turn around and withdraw along their approach vector, or they make a navigational error, panic-induced, calculation error-induced, it varies, that drifts them across the boundary, at which point the interdiction shifts to contact and withdrawal protocol, which is a more involved procedure, but still well within the operational template. 4 outcomes, across 41 prior operations, across 19 years of service, and every documented case in the Directorate's records dating back to the founding of the Kethani Reach Watch Station. Every contact grade 2 species had produced one of those 4 outcomes within 40 minutes of the signal activation. I designed the Kethani Reach operation to contain all 4 possible outcomes within a response window of 6 hours from initial signal contact. 6 hours was generous. Most grade 2 operations resolved in under 90 minutes. I had built-in redundancies at every decision node. The severance of paths carried a full interdiction complement. Active array, suppression field emitters calibrated for the human vessel's documented drive signatures, 3 escort screening vessels positioned at the boundary markers, a dedicated tight beam relay back to the Directorate's secondary monitoring station at Reach Station 12, and a passive sensor array capable of producing detailed hull and crew signature data on any vessel within 120 light seconds. The operation was, on paper, among the most thoroughly prepared Grade 2 interdictions the Directorate had mounted in a decade. I was confident in the model. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters for what follows. I was not arrogant. I was trained not to mistake confidence for certainty, and I believe in the honest assessment of my own psychology that I maintain that distinction. But I was confident. 41 prior operations. A record that had never produced an unclassified outcome. A model that, as far as the Directorate's entire institutional history could demonstrate, described the universe accurately. I arrived aboard the Severance of Paths 19 days before the human vessel's projected approach to the Kethani Reach boundary. During those 19 days, I ran 7 full-system rehearsals of the interdiction sequence, drilling every crew member in the analysis center on their specific function until the rehearsals were producing response times 2 standard, deviations below the operational requirement. I reviewed the intercept data on the human ship 4 times in full. I convened 3 separate analysis sessions with the linguistics team, led by senior specialist Kavorith Dren, a practitioner cast member with 12 years of contact linguistics experience, to ensure we had the best available translation tools ready for any human communication that might occur during the operation. I reviewed the behavioral modeling outputs for the human species 6 times. The outputs were consistent. The species displayed no anomalous behavioral indicators beyond the capability flags already noted. The behavioral model placed humanity squarely within the Grade 2 response envelope. The vessel the Directorate had designated as our target carried a human designation that translated, in our notation, as a name of place followed by a name of watch, a survey designation, which was consistent with the non-military classification the Directorate had assigned. I will call it the Calder's Watch throughout this deposition, as that is the closest phonetic rendering our linguistics team could produce. Its sensor profile suggested a crew complement of between 30 and 60 individuals. Its drive signature indicated a long-range survey class, not a warship, not a military vessel, no military-grade weapon systems in the active configuration. The Directorate's intelligence assessment described the probable crew as scientific or exploratory in function, with a probability of 91.4% that the vessel would comply with a non-passage declaration and withdraw without incident within the first 2 hours of contact. 91.4%. I have thought about that number quite a lot in the years since. Let me describe the severance of paths for the record, because the asymmetry of the engagement is important to understanding what followed. The severance of paths is a compact interdiction cruiser of the Velhari class. I was not involved in the naming of the class, and I note the coincidence without comment. It displaces approximately 400,000 compact mass units. Its crew complement was 311 personnel at the time of the interdiction. It carries 47 weapon systems across its forward and lateral arrays, with an additional 16 suppression-specific systems not included in the weapon count. It is capable of producing a suppression field sufficient to neutralize the drive systems of any vessel of contact grade. 2 classification within a range of 40 light seconds. By any measurable standard of comparative capability, the severance of paths against a 30 to 60 crew survey frigate was not a contest. It was a demonstration. That was by design. Interdiction operations are not intended to be fair. They are intended to be unambiguous. The Calder's Watch appeared on the forward watch buoys at 0347 station time on the day of the interdiction. It was precisely on the approach vector our projections had indicated. Not approximately, not within acceptable variance, but precisely on it, suggesting their navigational methodology was either more sophisticated than our models had estimated, or they had their own survey data on this region that matched ours in significant detail. Its drive signature matched our intercept data. Its transponder emissions were consistent with 11 days of prior monitoring. The vessel was moving at a moderate survey class velocity, making no evasive maneuvers, broadcasting what appeared to be navigational identification on a standard open frequency. I was in the Command Analysis Center aboard the Severance of Paths when the forward buoys picked up the approach. Practitioner Asif Ran, my second-in analysis, confirmed the identification within 4 minutes. I authorized signal array activation at 0402. The non-passage declaration went out on all documented human use frequencies, plus the full standard compact diplomatic spectrum at 0403. I want to dwell for a moment on what that declaration was and what it was meant to do, because the tribunal should understand this, in order to understand the significance of what happened next. The compact non-passage declaration is not a communication in the conversational sense. It does not invite response. It does not present an argument. It is, in its structure and its intent, a notice, the equivalent in physical space of a barrier. It says, in language calibrated for maximum clarity across species communication barriers, this line exists. You are approaching it. You may not cross it. The vehicle delivering this notice has the capability to enforce the notice. It contains no information about why the line exists, who drew it, what authority stands behind it, or what would happen to the target vessel if it attempted to cross. These omissions are not oversights. They are doctrine. The Compact's behavioral modeling research, conducted over 240 years of contact operations, had established that ambiguity about enforcement capacity reduces compliance in grade 2 and 3 species, while ambiguity about legal authority has no measurable effect on compliance. The declaration therefore maximizes clarity on capability and provides nothing else. This doctrine had been validated across 240 years of contact operations. The Calder's watch received the signal. I am certain of this because its navigational emissions changed character at 0407, a 4-minute lag consistent with light speed delay at the vessel's then current range. Something aboard the Calder's watch changed when the signal reached it. The drive output altered, not a deceleration, not a course change, but a reconfiguration. A power distribution shift that our engineering analysis described in the operational log notation as consistent with a vessel transitioning from survey mode operation to an alternative operational mode not yet identified. At 0411, the Calder's watch made its first transmission in response to the non-passage declaration. I had expected silence. I had expected one of the 4 outcomes to begin manifesting. What I received instead was a transmission on the same frequencies we had used. Not broadcast, not automatic, but directed, aimed at the severance of paths specifically, in a format that our communications analysis immediately flagged as structured and intentional. Not a distress signal, not a navigational beacon, not an automated emergency response sequence, a structured transmission, language, a direct reply. I want to be precise about the timing because it matters. Signal transit time at the Calder's watch's then current range was approximately 4 minutes. Their reply arrived at 0411, 4 minutes after we confirmed the signal had reached them. That means they began composing or transmitting their reply at approximately the moment the signal arrived. They did not deliberate. They did not hold a conference. They did not sit with the declaration for 10 minutes or 30 minutes while their command structure processed the situation. They replied immediately. The Compact's non-passage declaration does not invite a reply. It is not a communication. It contains no question. The standard Grade 2 response protocol contains no provision for a responding transmission within the first contact hour. Because in 240 years of contact operations and every documented case in the Directorate's records, no contact grade 2 species had ever replied to a non-passage declaration within the first hour. Several had attempted communication after a holding period of many hours or days, after they had stabilized their position, consulted their command structure, and presumably resolved their immediate fear state enough to attempt a rational action. None had replied in 4 minutes. The Calder's watch replied in 4 minutes. Practitioner Ron flagged it as anomalous and logged it accordingly. I told her to continue monitoring and asked Dren's linguistics team to begin analysis of the transmission. I adjusted the model's response tree to account for an early communication attempt. This was not outside the range of grade 2 behavior in the strictest statistical sense, merely at the outermost edge of the expected distribution. The model absorbed it. I noted the anomaly and held my position. What the model could not absorb was what the transmission contained. Our linguistics team spent 11 minutes on the initial transmission. I watched them work from the analysis station. They were thorough and they were fast. Dren had trained them well, and they had the advantage of a human communication structure that, while unfamiliar, showed a degree of regularity that made rapid analysis possible. At the end of 11 minutes, Dren came to my station himself, not a written report. He came in person. He stood at the display and said, with the particular careful neutrality that experienced analysts adopt when they are not certain whether the data is wrong or they are, "Sund, the translation is not perfect, but what they appear to be saying is that they want to know what we want." I told him to run it again. He ran it 3 more times with cross-analysis from 2 additional team members. The transmission was asking, as clearly as the human communication structure could render the question in frequencies we had used, what the compact vessel's purpose was at the boundary, not what the transmission was, not what the signal meant, not whether there was a senior authority they should contact. What we wanted, a contact grade 2 species. Upon receiving a non-passage declaration from a vessel of significantly superior capability at a declared boundary, does not ask the boundary vessel what it wants. A contact grade 2 species assesses the power differential, perceives the threat it represents, consults its available behavioral options, and selects from the documented 4. The model did not contain a branch in which the target species treated the declaration as the opening of a negotiation. The model did not contain this branch, not because the designers had overlooked it, but because no prior data had suggested it was a branch that needed to exist. I authorized a decline and reiterate transmission. Standard language, standard format, restating the non-passage notice and declining the implied communication request. I held position. I waited. The Calder's watch held position as well. It did not withdraw. It did not advance. It did not attempt to sweep its sensors across the severance of paths in any targeting consistent configuration. It held at approximately 90 light seconds short of the boundary line, and it waited. Not anchored, its drives were live, its navigational systems active, but deliberately stationary. It was holding because it had decided to hold, not because it was calculating whether it could run, or because it was paralyzed by the asymmetry of the engagement. This was anomalous. A grade 2 species holding its position 90 light seconds from a declared boundary rather than withdrawing to a safe assessment distance of several hundred or several thousand light seconds, where the power differential would be somewhat more psychologically manageable, was statistically very unusual. I logged it. We sent the decline and reiterate at 0429. Their reply arrived at 0432, 3 minutes transit. That gave them approximately 90 seconds to process our response and begin transmitting their own. Dren translated it in 8 minutes. Faster than the first, he was learning the structure. The reply said, "Acknowledged. Please identify the authority under which the boundary is declared." I sat with that translation for a long time. A contact grade 2 species does not ask for legal citation. The concept of questioning the authority of a vastly superior vessel at a declared boundary is not a concept the model contained, not because the model's designers had overlooked it, but because the model's foundational logic had no room for it. The authority of the declaration is the vessel, and what the vessel can do to you if you fail to comply. That is the totality of the message. The Compact's 240 years of behavioral research had established, with a consistency that no one in the directorate had ever had cause to doubt, that a contact grade 2 species receiving that message understands the message in those terms. The declaration is not a legal document inviting annotation. It is a physical fact. The Calder's Watch wanted to know who had drawn the line and under what legal framework. I will not pretend I was not, at this point, experiencing something I had not encountered in 19 years of operational service. Not alarm. I do not experience operational alarm easily. And the vessel was not threatening, not advancing, not doing anything that the severance of paths could not handle in a matter of seconds, if necessary. But cognitive friction is the only term I have for it. The model was producing outcomes for which it had no category, in sequence, at a pace that suggested the Calder's Watch crew was not confused or uncertain. They were responding deliberately. Whatever they were doing was intentional and it was considered. I activated the passive sensor array across the full spectrum, not to target the Calder's Watch. Targeting would have escalated the engagement in a direction I was not authorized to pursue without directorate instruction, but to get a detailed picture of what I was dealing with. I wanted hull data. I wanted interior configuration data. I wanted crew emission signatures that would tell me something about the vessel's current operational state. I wanted to know, specifically, whether the bioscan data would show the internal thermal and neurochemical signature patterns consistent with a crew in acute stress, elevated, output in the biological markers that, across every species in the Directorate's contact database, corresponded to what we broadly classified as fear state physiology. The passive scan took 40 minutes to produce a useful picture at that range. What it produced was this, a survey-class vessel with a lean hull profile, somewhat longer than our initial estimates had suggested, not significantly, but the discrepancy noted and logged. Hull surface temperature consistent with normal operational heating. Drive temperature consistent with low-power holding configuration. No elevated readings on any of the exterior systems that would indicate internal emergency preparation. No evidence of weapon system warm-up. No evidence of emergency drive preparation. No evidence of hull integrity preparation of the kind that precedes either fight or flight. Crew emission signatures consistent with approximately 47 individuals actively at stations, with the remainder in what the bioscan interpreted as a scheduled rest rotation. Not crisis configuration, not emergency all hands. Routine rest cycling, the same rotation pattern our analysts said they would expect from a vessel conducting normal long-duration deep survey. Operations in a region where no engagement was anticipated. The individuals at stations showed bioscan signatures within normal operational parameters, elevated attention indicators, which was expected. We had their full crew's focus, but not elevated in the pattern associated with threat response physiology. The elevation was the kind associated in the Directorate's comparative bioscan library, with concentration, with careful work. The weapon systems were at survey-idle power levels, not elevated, not charged for engagement, not cycling in any way that suggested the crew was weighing whether to use them. The power distribution shift we had flagged at 0407, the reconfiguration after the initial signal, had gone to communication systems and passive sensor arrays. They had been scanning us from the moment our signal reached them. I want to be precise about that finding because it is significant. For the 40 minutes during which my engineering analysis team was working to produce a detailed picture of the Calder's Watch, the Calder's Watch had been producing a detailed picture of us. They had redirected power from non-essential survey systems to their passive sensor suite, and they had been running a systematic, calm, unhurried assessment of the severance of paths. Not a sweep, a systematic array, methodical and sustained. The kind of scan you run when you intend to know something thoroughly, not when you are deciding whether to run. They had done this before replying, or simultaneously with composing the reply. The timing was too close to determine the sequence precisely. Both are plausible. What is not plausible, given the bioscan data and the sensor power distribution, is that the crew of the Calder's watch had received a non-passages declaration from a compact interdiction cruiser and been paralyzed by it. They had not been paralyzed by the power differential. They had assessed it, noted it, and continued working. I logged all of this and held it alongside the behavioral anomalies already in the record. I noted this in the operational log and moved on to the next transmission exchange. I did not at this point fully understand what the finding meant. I understood it later. I am telling you the sequence in which I understood things because the sequence matters. The authorization for the second decline and reiterate went out at 0453. Their reply arrived at 0456. Kavorath Dren did not use a written report this time either. He came to my station. He said, "They have asked us to connect them with our commanding authority so that the status of the boundary can be discussed. They have added," and here he paused with the expression of a professional who had encountered an anomaly sufficiently large that professional neutrality was beginning to cost him visible effort. They have added that if we are not empowered to discuss boundary status at the field operations level, they will be pleased to hold at their current position for whatever period is required for an empowered representative to arrive. They specify that they have sufficient provisions for 90 days. There was a second element to the transmission that Dren had not mentioned, which I read in the written analysis when it came through 6 minutes later. The closing section of the human transmission included what the linguistics team subsequently confirmed was a standard human courtesy formula, a communication element indicating non-hostile intent and willingness to proceed at whatever pace suited the receiving party, an expression of goodwill, at the end of a message informing a compact interdiction force that the survey vessel planned to stay parked at their boundary for up to 3 months. The model had no category for this. I did not attempt to fit it into one. I took the full written analysis back to the operations desk, and I sat with it for a long time. And what I found myself thinking was not about the model for the first time in the engagement. What I found myself thinking was, who are these people? That question was unprofessional. It was not a question the operational framework provided tools to answer. It was also the right question. And the fact that it took me that long to ask it tells me something about the limitations of a model that trains practitioners not to ask it. I spent 12 hours pulling every piece of intelligence the directorate had assembled on humanity, not skimming reading, intercept logs going back 4 years, survey maps, drive signature catalogs, linguistic fragment analyses from every contact the directorate had attempted, including 2 earlier boundary encounters that had been logged as inconclusive and filed without significant annotation. I looked at the communication traffic patterns between human vessels across the intercept record, not the content, which we had only partial decryption for, but the volume, the frequency, the timing, and the structural patterns the linguistics analysis had identified. I looked at how often they talked to each other, and when, and how long the exchanges lasted, and what structural features recurred. I also, for the first time, looked carefully at the earlier inconclusive boundary encounters. Both had occurred more than 2 years before my assignment. In both cases, the compact vessel involved had issued a non-passage declaration. In both cases, the human vessel had held its position longer than the Grade 2 model predicted before eventually withdrawing. The operational logs of both encounters noted the holding behavior as anomalous and recommended follow-up analysis. Neither encounter's recommendation had been acted on. The files had been closed, annotated as species-consistent behavior within outer variants, and archived. No one had connected them to each other. No one had connected them to the capability anomalies flagged in the intelligence survey. No one had drawn the line that I was now drawing in a locked analysis room at 4 a.m. on the second day of the Kethani Reach engagement. I noted this for the record and moved on. What I found in the main body of the intercept and communication data was a pattern I had not flagged when I reviewed this material the first time for the operation, because it had not seemed operationally relevant. Humanity communicated internally at a volume that was high even by the standards of species with documented high communication cultures. Not high in the way of military communication traffic, not high because of emergency or coordination need, but high in the way of a culture where communication was a baseline activity rather than a specific purpose tool. The linguistics analysis of the traffic structure had flagged, in a notation I had previously dismissed as a category artifact from an analysis system not optimized for human traffic, that an unusually high proportion of the communications traffic was composed of what the analyst had described as interrogative constructs. Questions. Humans asked each other questions at a rate that was statistically remarkable compared to every contact-grade species in the Directorate's database, not by a small margin. The interrogative proportion of human communications traffic was, according to the linguistics analysis, more than twice the rate of the highest-ranked species currently in the database. They asked questions the way other species stated facts, as a primary communicative mode rather than a specific purpose one. They asked questions in operational communications, in what appeared to be social communications, in what appeared to be formal command structure exchanges. They asked questions of each other constantly, and the responses generated more questions. And the chains extended across entire conversation logs in a pattern that the analysis system, which had been designed to look for information request sequences as a specific behavioral event, had struggled to categorize because for humans, the information request pattern was not a specific behavioral event. It was continuous. It was how they thought together. They were curious. I do not mean they experienced curiosity occasionally, in specific contexts, as a response to specific stimuli. I mean that curiosity appeared to be their cognitive baseline, the default operating mode. The default state of a human, as far as the intercept record allowed me to reconstruct, was someone who found the universe interesting and wanted to know things about it, including, as I had now witnessed firsthand, things about who was blocking their survey route and under what legal authority, including what we wanted, including how our governance worked, including everything. I considered what this meant for the foundational assumption. I did not yet articulate the conclusion fully. That came later, on day 12, when I sat with the entire 11-day record and read it as a complete sequence rather than a series of anomalies. But I noted, in the operational log at 0341 on day 3, before I went to sleep for 4 hours, that the behavioral pattern I was observing was consistent with a species whose cognitive architecture did not sort the universe into threats to manage and environments to operate in. It appeared to sort everything, including threats, including power differentials, including a compact interdiction cruiser at a boundary, into problems to understand. I slept for 4 hours. I returned to the analysis center. The Calder's watch was still there, 90 light seconds out, passive scan running, holding position with the same calm precision it had held for 16 hours. Not a degree of drift, not a navigational adjustment. Exactly where it had settled at 0407 on the first day. I wrote a new transmission, not a decline and reiterate. The protocol had no template for what I wanted to say, which meant I was writing without a template for the first time in 19 years. With Dren's linguistic assistance, I composed a message that stated, as clearly as I could render it in their language, that the compact interdiction directive held authority over the Kethani Reach boundary by right of the Kethani Compact Charter of Agreed Approaches, ratified by the 47 member states of the Harmony Compact, and that the boundary's status was not subject to renegotiation at field operative level. I told them the non-passage declaration stood. Then, because Dren had included a courtesy formula addendum in his draft and I had spent 12 hours reading an intercept record that told me courtesy formulas were not small things to these people, I kept it in. And I added, on my own initiative, a question, not an intelligence question, not a protocol question. I asked them where they were going. Their reply came 41 minutes later. At a 2-minute signal transit lag, They had spent 39 minutes composing it. I noted the time investment. When the written translation arrived, 4 hours after the transmission, it ran to 11 pages. I will not read all 11 pages into the record. The tribunal has access to the full translation document. What I will convey is its content, because the content is what matters. They were going to a stellar object in their catalog that resolved, in compact survey notation, as a red dwarf system approximately 60 light-years beyond the Kethani boundary. The system had been flagged in their long-range passive survey data. I noted, reading this, that they had long-range passive survey data, which should have been operationally impossible for a vessel of their class, and confirmed the anomalous capability indicator the Directorate had, flagged 14 months earlier, as potentially bearing atmospheric chemical markers associated with prior biological activity. They were not certain the markers were significant. They wanted to look. The survey mission was the third in a planned sequence that had been in development for 6 years, since before the current crew had been assigned to the vessel. The crew of the Calder's Watch had been in continuous deep-range operation for 11 months at the time of our engagement. Their most recent resupply and rest rotation had been at a human station the translation rendered as something like Callaway's Deep, which their own documentations described as being located, in their reckoning, at what they called the edge of the map. They had been operating beyond the edge of their own map for 11 months, looking for something that might have been alive once in a star system, 60 light-years past a boundary that a compact interdiction cruiser was now blocking, and their response to the blockade was to offer to wait 90 days and write us 11 pages of transparent survey documentation. I want to be precise about what was in those 11 pages, because the Directorate's subsequent analysis suggested the transparency might have been strategic, that the Calder's Watch crew might have calculated that full disclosure would produce a better operational outcome than withholding. The Directorate's analysis is not wrong to consider this. It is the kind of analysis the Directorate is built to produce. What the Directorate does not adequately account for is Cavareth Dren's assessment of the communication structure itself, which he gave me verbally before the written report was complete, and which I am entering into the record now because it belongs here. Dren said, "Sond, I have spent 12 years analyzing contact-grade communication for strategic misdirection. I can tell you, with the confidence that 12 years gives me, that this transmission does not contain any. The communication pattern anomalies I would expect to see in a species managing strategic disclosure are not present. This is a crew that answered your question because you asked it, and they thought you deserved an answer. I am aware that this is a subjective professional judgment. I am also aware that Cavareth Dren has the best pattern recognition instincts in the Directorate's Linguistics Division. I note it for the record. I transmitted a receipt acknowledgement and referred their documentation to the Directorate's next authority tier. I told them, with Dren's courtesy formula, that I appreciated their response. Then I went back to the model. I went back to it with a specific question that I had not previously asked, because the question had never been necessary. The question was, what is the foundational assumption? Every predictive model rests on foundational assumptions. Most practitioners do not examine them, because the assumptions have been validated so thoroughly and for so long that examining them would feel like examining the assumption that gravity pulls in the same direction it pulled yesterday. It would feel like excess. It would feel, in an operational culture that rewards efficient decision-making, like a waste of time better spent on variables that actually move. The foundational assumption underlying the Compact's entire contact-grade classification system and the behavioral models that derive from it was not a secret. It was stated in the original research literature, which I had read in training 19 years earlier, and had not thought about substantively since. The assumption was this: a sapient species encountering a significantly superior force at a declared boundary will, at some point in the engagement, enter a behavioral state in which fear of the superior force constrains its available responses to the documented range of compliant outcomes. Not that they would necessarily be afraid in every subjective sense that word carries. The original research was careful on this point. Careful enough that I remember the specific language, which I read twice during those 12 hours at Reach Station 12, and which I have thought about many times since. The assumption was behavioral, not psychological. It stated that the encounter with significantly superior force would produce, through whatever mechanism was appropriate to each species' specific neurobiology and decision-making architecture, a narrowing of behavioral options toward compliance. The mechanism might be direct fear. It might be rational risk calculation. It might be social inhibition, command structure response, cultural constraint, or any number of other processes. The mechanism didn't matter. The outcome, the narrowing, the compliant behavior, was what the research had documented consistently across every species the compact had ever processed. 240 years of contact operations had validated this assumption. Every species, without deviation significant enough to survive peer review. I had built 41 interdictions on that assumption. The directorate had built its entire contact management doctrine on it, and sitting in the analysis room at Reach Station 12, reading the Kethani Reach operational log for the 4th time, I was looking at 11 days of data that the assumption could not explain. The Calder's watch had been 90 light seconds from the severance of paths for 11 days. The severance of paths outclassed it in every measurable category of combat capability by a factor our own doctrine classified as resolution, asymmetry, a designation meaning, in operational terms, that the outcome of any engagement between the two vessels was not a question of tactics, but a question of physics, not even interesting physics. The Calder's watch crew knew this. Their passive scan had told them, in the first 40 minutes, exactly what they were facing. The bioscan data from that same period showed crew members at stations in a state of elevated concentration, not elevated threat response. They had received the information the passive scan produced, processed it, and continued doing their jobs. 11 days later, they were still there, still scanning, still corresponding, still, as best the bioscan could tell from 90 light seconds, in a state that looked less like prolonged endurance of a threatening situation and more like sustained engagement with an interesting problem. The assumption had not held. I had arrived at this conclusion by day 2. I had been circling around its implications for 9 more days. Now, with the full record in front of me and the closing transmission, we hope it goes well for both of us. Fresh in my thinking, I could not continue to avoid the implications. The assumption had failed because it was built on a premise that did not apply to humanity. The premise was that fear of superior force, or its functional equivalent, was a universal constraint on sapient behavioral options under sufficiently asymmetric conditions. The compact's research had documented this constraint in every species it had encountered. The research was not fraudulent, and the documentation was not wrong. The constraint was real in every species the compact had studied. But the compact had studied the species it had encountered, and the species it had encountered had all been, in some essential way I was only now beginning to articulate, species that sorted the universe into threats and non-threats, into territories of danger and territories of safety, into asymmetries to avoid and symmetries to seek. Species that read a power differential and felt, however they processed that feeling, something that produced the documented behavioral narrowing. What the compact had not previously encountered was a species for whom the universe was not primarily a map of threat differentials, a species whose baseline cognitive orientation was not threat assessment but comprehension seeking. For such a species, and I want to be careful here, because I am making an inference that extends beyond what the data strictly proves, and I note this caveat for the record. For such a species, the encounter with a significantly superior force at a declared boundary was not first and foremost a threat to manage. It was a situation to understand, And a situation you are trying to understand is, by definition, one in which your behavioral options have not narrowed toward compliance, because the understanding is not yet complete. The Directorate's response to my field report, the one I had transmitted on day one, flagging the behavioral anomalies and requesting guidance, arrived 72 hours into the engagement. It told me to hold position, maintain non-passage protocol, and await further instruction. This response told me, by what it did not say, that the Directorate was also uncertain. A Directorate that was certain would have given me a protocol adjustment or a recall order. Hold and await means we don't know either, and we need time. We held. The Calder's watch held. On day 4, they transmitted again. Not a demand, not a protest. A question about the compact, the first purely informational question they had asked, as distinct from the operational and legal questions of the first days. They wanted to know how many member states the Harmony Compact included, and how the compact made collective decisions. The question was, in Dren's analysis, framed with courtesy and without any evident strategic purpose. It read as genuine curiosity. He translated it and brought it to me and said, in the tone of a man who had decided to stop being surprised, "They want to know how we work." I did not reply to that transmission. The protocol did not authorize it, and I was not yet certain enough of my own judgment to act outside protocol again without more data. But I logged the question and I thought about it. On day 7, they sent technical documentation, a detailed description of the Calder's watch's survey sensor array, system specifications included, apparently offered as supporting evidence for the benign nature of their mission. Dren's assessment, not a threat calculation, not a strategic move. They were trying to be helpful. They had decided, apparently, that the most useful thing they could do was make it easier for us to verify their stated purpose. On day 9, they sent a story. I want to be precise about that. Not a summary, not a message with narrative elements, a story. A complete narrative, composed and transmitted with evident care, that Dren's team classified after 2 days of analysis as a culturally significant account from humanity's historical record. It was the story of a water surface mariner, a sailor from an era before humanity had left its homeworld, which placed it many centuries in their past, who had made a voyage to a coastline that no one from his civilization had previously seen. He had approached an inhabited shore. He had been met with hostility and with weapons he had no means to match. He had held his position in the water, not advancing, not retreating, anchored at a distance that was close enough to signal continued intent and far enough to signal that the intent was not aggression, and found, by patience and small gestures over many days, a way to begin communicating. The story ended with what Dren translated as an understanding between the mariner and the people of the shore that was described, in the narrative's final passage, as the beginning of something that neither side had been able to predict at the outset, and that had, in subsequent generations, become foundational to both. Dren spent 2 days on that translation. He did not want to get it wrong. He came to me when it was finished with the complete written analysis, and also, separately, with a verbal note that I am entering into this record because it belongs here. He said, "Sund, in 12 years of contact linguistics, I have analyzed communication intended to deceive, to intimidate, to delay, to negotiate, and to comply. I have analyzed communication from species with no conceptual framework for honesty and species for whom honesty was a social performance rather than a value. I have never analyzed a transmission that I am confident, to the standard I would stake my professional reputation on, was sent in simple good faith with no secondary purpose. This is that transmission. They sent us a story because they thought we might find it useful. That is all they were doing. I am aware that this is a subjective professional judgment. I am aware the tribunal may weigh it accordingly. I note it because Kavareth Dren had spent 2 days on that translation and had thought about it more carefully than anyone else who had read it, and his judgment is part of the record. The covering note, a brief framing statement that accompanied the story, said, in Dren's careful translation, They were not suggesting the situations were identical. They understood the comparison was imperfect, but their civilization had some accumulated experience with boundaries and the people who maintained them. And in their history, the conversations that happened at boundaries, however difficult to begin, had sometimes turned out to matter more than whether any crossing ever took place. I read the story 5 times. I read the covering note more times than I will specify. On the 5th reading of the story, I understood what they were doing, and understanding it was more unsettling than anything else in the 11 days, because it told me something I had been circling around without quite reaching. The Calder's watch crew was not waiting. They were not enduring. They were not counting down the hours until the directorate sent someone with authority to resolve the situation. They were investing 9 days into a standoff with a compact interdiction cruiser at a declared boundary. 47 people in a survey vessel they could not leave and could not advance past. They had decided that this time was worth something, that the situation itself, the correspondence, the questions, the technical documentation, the story, that these were not the overhead cost of a delay. They were the point. The crew of the Calder's watch had looked at the standoff and seen the beginning of something. I am a planner. I understand the professional value of treating time spent in uncertainty as time that can be used rather than simply endured. What the model I had built did not contain, what the Compact's entire contact-grade doctrine did not contain, was the possibility that a contact Grade 2 species could look at a vastly superior interdiction cruiser at a non-passage boundary and see not a threat to be managed, not an obstacle to be navigated, not a force to be endured, but an opportunity. Not an opportunity to outmaneuver or to exploit, an opportunity to begin. I have thought about the mariner's story many times since day 9 of the engagement. I have thought about the mariner holding position in the water, anchored at a distance that communicated intent without aggression, and about what kind of person chooses to hold that position instead of retreating to safety or advancing to confrontation. I have thought about the patience required, not passive patience, not the patience of someone waiting out a situation, but the active, patient investment of someone who believes that the distance between two parties who cannot yet speak to each other is a distance worth crossing at whatever pace the situation permits, and who is prepared to do the work of crossing it from their side, without certainty that the other side will move at all. I do not know if the crew of the Calder's watch told each other that story regularly, or had it in their training, or encountered it as children in the way that stories from deep cultural memory are sometimes encountered. I do not know whether the choice to send it to us was a crew decision, or a single officer's initiative, or something in between. What I know is that they chose it out of everything they could have sent on day 9 of a standoff with a compact interdiction force. And they sent it with a covering note that says, in essence, "We have been here before on the other side of a boundary, with people who had reason not to trust us. We know how this can go if everyone is willing to do the work." They were telling us they were willing to do the work. That is what I understood on the 5th reading. That is what I carried through the remaining 2 days of the engagement and the 3-hour transit back to Reach Station 12 and the 63 pages of formal after-action report and the 3 years since. They were willing to do the work of beginning, from their side, without certainty of reciprocation. At 90 light seconds from a vessel that could end the Calder's watch in a matter of physics rather than tactics, they were willing to do that work, and they were doing it actively every day of the 11 days. On day 12, the directorate ordered me to break contact, not to resolve the situation, not to escalate to the next engagement tier. To end the engagement, withdraw the severance of paths and all 3 escort screening vessels to Reach Station 12, and reclassify the Kethani Reach boundary segment as administratively suspended pending full directorate review. The order was marked immediate. I transmitted a closing notice to the Calder's watch. With Dren's assistance, I wrote it carefully, more carefully than anything else I had written in 19 years of service, which tells you something about what 11 days had done to my understanding of the situation. I told them the matter had been referred to a higher authority and that we were withdrawing to allow the review to proceed. I included the courtesy formula. I told them, and this was not in the protocol. I added it on my own initiative, and I note it for the record, that I had found the correspondence instructive. Their reply came in 3 minutes. It said, "Understood. We will remain at our current position and await the outcome of the review. We hope it proceeds well for both of us." I held that translation in my hands during the entire transit back to Reach Station 12. 3 hours. I read it many times. At Reach Station 12, I wrote my formal after-action report. 63 pages. The tribunal has it. I will not summarize it here, but I will read into the record, as the tribunal has requested, the single paragraph of formal recommendation at the report's conclusion. Based on the operational data collected during the Kethani Reach interdiction of the human survey vessel designated Calder's Watch, this office recommends the following in order of priority. First, that the Compact's contact grade classification system be immediately reviewed, with specific attention to its foundational behavioral assumption, and that a new category be established for species that demonstrate consistent non-alignment with the fear constraint compliance model, that humanity be assigned to this new category, effective upon this report's receipt, and that all subsequent compact operations involving human vessels be designed from foundational principles appropriate to that category rather than modified from existing Grade 2 or Grade 3 templates. Second, that the Compact Intelligence Directorate initiate, at the earliest practicable date, and as a matter of operational priority, a formal diplomatic approach to human governing authorities with the objective of establishing normalized relations and agreed frameworks for mutual boundary management. Third, and most important, that the Directorate's senior tier review the foundational assumption underlying the entirety of the contact grade system, not because humanity represents a threat in the conventional sense, but because a system built on an assumption that fails for one species may be failing in subtler ways. For others we have already classified and believe we understand. I make this recommendation not from alarm, but from operational necessity. In 47 years of service, I have not previously encountered a species dangerous in the conventional sense that simultaneously sends its adversaries stories about patient mariners and wishes them well at the close of a standoff. The category we built for them is not wrong because humanity is dangerous. It is wrong because it was built to describe something humanity is not. That is the recommendation I filed. That is what I concluded. That is what I still conclude without revision or softening 3 years on. The tribunal has asked me why the interdiction failed. I have answered that question. The answer is, it did not fail for recoverable reasons. It failed because it was designed to produce a behavioral outcome in a species that was not capable of producing that outcome. Not incapable of fear. I have no data sufficient to make that claim, and I would not make it. Incapable of being reduced to it. Incapable of letting the asymmetry of the engagement become the only lens through which the engagement was perceived. 47 people in a survey vessel parked at a boundary they could not cross, facing a force that could destroy them without material effort, had chosen to treat those 11 days as something worth spending on. The plan had been perfect. It had measured every variable the model said was measurable. What the plan could not measure was what it had been trained not to look for. I have one further observation, and then I am done. The tribunal will have access to the diplomatic normalization data for the 3 years since the Kethani Reach engagement. In that time, humanity has sent the compact 47 delegations, 11 survey teams, 9 academic exchange parties, and what I am told was a very well-attended cultural exhibition aboard the station at Kethani Prime. The compact has sent humanity 3 formal delegations and 1 administrative liaison in the same period. The Directorate compiled these numbers and presented them to the Senior Cast Council as evidence of a favorable asymmetry in diplomatic investment. interpreted as proof that humanity was more eager for the relationship, and that this eagerness represented a strategic advantage the compact should manage carefully. I read that analysis. I thought of Kavorth Dren coming to my station on day one, with the careful neutrality of a man who had hoped his translation was wrong, telling me that the Calder's watch wanted to know what we wanted. The Directorate looked at the asymmetry and saw an advantage to manage. The Directorate is still measuring the wrong thing. That is all I have for the record.